The Denver Broncos are going to have to make some tough decisions with roster cuts looming on Tuesday, 2 o'clock p.m. Mountain Time. We'll dive deep into stock up, stock down in terms of making the best case for the roster. On top of that, who are the biggest surprise cuts that could land up on this list? We'll break it down and much more here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com, and want to say thanks to all the everydayers and first listeners out there in Broncos Country. Thanks for making the show exactly what it is. Subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team from every single angle. That's what we bring here to the table, Locked On Broncos. And here's what you can expect on today's episode of the show, Broncos Country, with roster cuts looming. Who are some trade cut candidates that we'll dive deep into? We're going to dive into some roster superlatives, biggest roster questions here after the NFL preseason, and more importantly, taking a look at the stock report after the Broncos' third and final preseason game, highlighting some players who maybe elevated their stock, which best increases their chance of making the roster. You can get all that here on today's episode of the show, which is brought to you by FanDuel. And now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Sayre, my friend, let's get into the stock report here on the eve of roster cuts. A lot of shuffling will be taking place, my friend, and not sure exactly how it's going to pan out here for the Broncos.
I'm not either. I'm excited, though, obviously, to see how this roster gets, kind of finalized by Sean Payton. And I do think we'll see, like you mentioned earlier, some surprise names make the team, some surprise names getting cut. The Broncos making maybe decisions based out of financial motivations or continually just getting younger and younger all over this roster. But in terms of like the stock up, stock down, I think we start at the quarterback position where Zach Wilson seems to be the hottest guy other than Bo Nix on the roster in terms of just the overall perception of what he's been doing, the hype that he's been getting from the different coaches speaking to the media. And I would say his stock is up and Jarrett Stidham stock down, especially after some of the comments that we saw Stidham make. Can't fault him for being honest after the game, Cody, but I mean, the difference in what Stidham said in his media availability about Bo Nix being named the starter versus what Zach Wilson said was a little bit shocking in certain ways. And so I think, I don't know, to me, Zach Wilson, the stock just keeps going up, and Jarrett Stidham, to me, the stock is down.
I know a lot of those comments definitely soured, I think, Broncos fans' perception on Jarrett Stidham. And look, I still think that there's a split in the fan base of people who want Jarrett Stidham as the backup, people who want Zach Wilson, and certainly that's fine. I would say Zach's approach, though, is like the more PR way of doing it. Like, you want to buy good favor. Like, Zach's comments were supportive of Bo, and I know Jarrett is supportive of Bo, but obviously in that moment there in terms of the decision, maybe he could have answered that question a little better. I wrote this in my Aftermath Monday piece on milehighsports.com. I talked about how when you look at these two QBs, Wilson and Stidham, Zach Wilson is trying to rebuild his image in terms of what has happened so far throughout his career, and Sean Payton has given him a platform to do it, whereas Jarrett Stidham is still really trying to build his image. We don't exactly know what Jarrett Stidham is just yet. We've seen flashes from him, but when you look at Zach Wilson, his overall experience, it tends to weigh in his favor in comparison to a guy like Jarrett. So I think that that's a fair assessment on the stock report. When we look at QBs, Wilson stock up, Stidham stock down. Let's go to running backs now. Stock up, I think, has probably been the most consistent outside of Jaleel McLaughlin. Tyler Beatty's probably been the most consistent running back, has been a little bit of the flashiest in a sense in terms of him playing with, those later string guys. And we're excluding really Javonte from this conversation. But Tyler Beatty has made a really strong argument for the active roster, whereas I think you look at stock down, Samaje Perine really since week 1 of the preseason has been there. He also didn't play in that third and final preseason game, which I don't think is an indication of, hey, he's safe on the roster. Could just be like, hey, let's try to maybe push him through waivers and just re-sign him. You don't necessarily have to push him through waivers because he's a vet. Let's just release him and then re-sign him to the practice squad. More than likely, I think that'll be the plan.
And if he's willing and open to do that, I think that'd be awesome. With Tyler Beatty, you just kind of hope that you can get him through the practice squad. I know he didn't necessarily go out there and dominate in the preseason, but made enough big plays, in my opinion, to be at least a consideration here for that fourth back on this team. And we'll see what happens with the Broncos, what they end up doing with Samaje Perine. I feel like he will have value elsewhere in the league, probably higher on somebody's depth chart than fourth. And so I think ultimately we'll talk more about him as the show goes on. But to me, they did hold Perine out of that game for reasons other than, man, he's definitely making this roster. Wide receiver is where the discussions become a little bit more complicated because you have so many guys, and Sean Payton alluded to it earlier in training camp, like too many guys that's probably going to make this roster or that will make rosters around the league than you can actually keep. Brandon Johnson may be the most notable name on this, Cody, that I would say is stock up right now based on what he did in that final preseason game. And stock down, I don't know that there's anybody in this receiver room whose stock is down other than right now maybe Philip Dorsett, who had a ball hit him in the chest in the preseason. We didn't see him do anything in the return game. So to me, Dorsett is the stock down at wide receiver, but picking guys at that position is going to be tough either way.
It's not a job I want to have here if I'm George Payton, Sean Payton. But to Sean's point here, they really are in alignment on a lot of the decisions that, have been made. I think a good portion of this roster in their eyes are already set outside of, a few spots. And Sean said it after the game that we have a great idea as to like where our roster is going to pan out and things like that. I agree there. Let's go to tight end, fullback here. Stock up Nate Adkins, which I feel like that's kind of been trending that direction all entire offseason. Core 4 special teams player, obviously had some good performance throughout the preseason. I thought he had a really good block on that Bo Nix keeper on the left side against the Indianapolis Colts. Had himself a touchdown catch, had himself a 19-yard catch, has demonstrated he could be a versatile guy. Whereas I know you have it listed here on the stock down for Michael Burton. I still think Burton is safe. If anything, I think that Burton is probably going to mentor a guy like Nate Adkins this year and possibly take over that role full time going into next season. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but I think that actually somebody else's stock is probably a little bit more down than Michael Burton's. That will lead to, I think, Nate Adkins getting a spot on the 53-man roster. Your quick thoughts on that? Because now it's like, hey, we still have some other positions we got to get to.
Right. I do like the Nate Adkins stock up, obviously. Michael Burton, the only reason I would say his stock down, Cody, is you get a nugget drop during the game from Andrew Catalon of CBS, who says specifically that Nate Adkins could be taking Michael Burton's spot on this roster. So not sure what he heard from Sean Payton in their pregame meetings that they have as a broadcast network. So that's going to be interesting to see. Line stock up Jordan Jackson. I think that kind of pushes everybody else at that position group down, because if Jordan Jackson makes the team, Cody, that pushes pretty much everybody else potentially off the roster if you only keep 5 defensive linemen. So I liked what we saw from him in the preseason, and there's a couple other defenders as well whose stock is up. They ended on a high note here after that Cardinals game.
Yeah, Justin Sternada, linebacker, 6 tackles, 1 sack, 1 forced fumble. Justin has looked good all throughout training camp. He's looked good in the preseason to the point where Broncos fans, I think, are starting to say, like, okay, this is the guy that, you've actually, like, this is who you drafted in a sense. Like, he's looking like it. And look, I think his development has always been on a positive trajectory. He missed his rookie season with the wrist injury there. But, man, has he been a very good special teams player for you. I'm confident now if he had to step onto the field at linebacker at any point of the season, I feel like he would do a good job in that regard there. And then obviously Keidron Smith, who recovered the fumble that he had forced. And then he punched one out during the game as well and ended up bouncing out of bounds. I think that overall Denver's contributions from a lot of your young guys have stood out. There are more stock ups, in my opinion, than there are stock downs. In Broncos Country, we always want to hear from you as well. Whose stock is the highest for you after the third and final preseason game on the eve of roster cuts? Whose stock is down? Make sure you let us know. But Sayre and I are going to play a little bit of game here at Broncos Country. We like to dive into some roster superlatives as roster cuts happen. Who is most likely to win the punter competition between Riley Dixon, Trenton Gil? We'll dive deep into that. And who's the most likely player to be traded before roster cuts out? That's something that you'll get here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos Country, today's episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at LinkedIn Jobs. And when you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, because LinkedIn Jobs has the tools that will help you find the right professionals for your team, faster, and best of all, for free. Because LinkedIn, they're not just a job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but they might be open to the perfect role if the opportunity presents itself. And in a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn specifically, 86% of small businesses, they get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. So hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. And LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or the resources to hire. That's why they're trying their best to make it easier for you. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
Who's the most likely to win the punter competition in Denver? Most likely to be traded? Who's the biggest name that could be cut by this team? Cody and I are going to go through some roster superlatives in the next couple segments here as we finish off today's episode, Locked On Broncos, which is the roster cut down week. And Cody, there's a lot going on in Broncos country. So we all, everybody that's listening, you can find Cody and I every single day bringing you the latest news, updates, content, analysis, and more for your beloved Denver Broncos, as well as you can check out for your second listen the Locked On NFL podcast, where you're going to get news and updates on all the other teams around the league. But we can't tell you enough how much we appreciate you for commenting, subscribing, and sharing the show however you choose to do so. Let's get into these roster superlatives here a little bit, Cody, because I think this is kind of an interesting way for us to look at things before the final roster is set. And we know that the initial 53-man roster is very much the initial 53-man roster. You never know what else is going to change the day after you have to turn in your roster to the league. But I think there are some questions that could be answered now as we kind of look toward, some of the bigger decisions that have to be made, right? Starting with the punter competition that went on this offseason, which was probably one of the more underrated storylines. I mean, it is a big deal. You're talking about flipping the field position, and you have a team that really values special teams, our coaching staff, that really values special teams. Let me know your thoughts on this, Cody, because I liked a little bit of what we saw there from Trenton Gil in the preseason, but who do you think is winning this punter competition?
Part of me feels like it's going to be Riley Dixon. I think when you look at Trenton Gil, certainly had the longest punt of the entire preseason at 67 yards. And look, he can boom it. There's no question about that. My reason that I have Riley Dixon winning this job is because I think when you need it to be consistent in terms of your trajectory, punting, getting it, where it needs to be versus, having a, one punt of 67 yards and then, a punt of 34 yards and a punt of 25 yards on one play. I think you get more consistency out of Riley Dixon, even though you get, I think, more boom potential from Trenton Gil. And I think that is the difference between this competition. I think both of them have hit the ball well, but Riley has been primarily more consistent and more accurate on getting it to where it needs to go versus Gil. That's my thought. I'm curious for yours, and then we'll dive into our next one.
Yeah, I think if we've seen the youth movement this offseason, I think the Broncos may go with a younger option here at the punter position in Trenton Gil. I mean, there's a reason, I think, why this team chose only one of the specialist spots to bring in competition all offseason, right? Riley Dixon is the only guy that faced competition. Long snapper Mitchell Fraboni, no competition. Will Lutz, no competition. Riley Dixon was the only guy. So we got to ask, why is that? Why did the Broncos do that? And what does this special teams staff see in somebody like Trenton Gil, who was a draft pick just a couple years ago by the Chicago Bears? And so I think there's that upside there. You have team control beyond this season with Trenton Gil, who's a restricted free agent, whereas Riley Dixon, he doesn't have that team control. He's a free agent after this year, and you could save a little over $1.7 million by cutting him. So not every decision is going to be financially motivated, though. We understand that. I mean, yes, it comes down to who's the best player right now, because special teams you can look at in a vacuum. You could bring Dixon back pretty easily. You could bring in a new punter pretty easily. So it's not that big of a long-term situation. But if you feel like you have a long-term punter in Trenton Gil, I think that's the direction to go there. And so that'd be my only thoughts on that, is that, man, maybe they feel like he is that long-term option. And I don't think there's going to be two punters, or I don't think there's going to be a punter that gets traded here, Cody. We see a lot of kickers get traded. But I do think the Broncos have a number of guys that could be interesting trade candidates as we get down to roster cuts. Because remember, not all these guys are going to get cut. Some of them do have trade value. And yes, there are teams that would want to trade for some of these players, despite what my Twitter mentions say, Cody, these days. But who do you feel like is the most likely player on this roster to be traded here as we approach roster cuts?
Yeah, this one's a tough one because it's like, okay, what position are we looking at here? I think if you look at running back, I feel like Samaje Perine could be traded. But then I always go back to this, Sarah, that we look at how depreciated the running back position has become in terms of valuation across the NFL. To me, is like, okay, which team is going to trade for a running back at this point? I don't think it's going to be very likely. So at that point, to me, it's going to have to be a wide receiver. Now, who is that? Like, I guarantee you, there are probably going to be some teams that call here in the next 24 hours about Tim Patrick. The Broncos, to my understanding, don't plan on moving on from him. But could a guy like you mentioned him earlier, could Brandon Johnson maybe garner some trade interest here? And look, if Trinity Benson of all people can garner trade capital, a guy like Brandon Johnson for a team out there that is going to need an athletic receiver that can do things consistently, I guarantee you, even if it's a 6th or a 7th round pick, I guarantee you that would be a guy that I could see. So I'm going to go with Brandon Johnson in this situation. Who do you have on yours?
I think that's a great name. I'm going to go with Jarrett Stidham as the guy that has maybe the most likely chance of being traded and maybe the most trade value right now because he plays the most valuable position in the league, obviously. And, you know, we did hear his comments after the game about how he feels like he's a starter in this league. And, you know, he believes in himself, who he is as a player, who he is as a person. And that wasn't the song that he was singing necessarily and the tone that he was saying it earlier in the offseason, right? Not in my opinion, at least. I mean, we've been listening to everything that he said throughout the offseason, and some of his words remain the same, but you could tell Cody he was a little upset after the game last night.
We just also received something from Tom Pelissero as we're recording the show. It says, important notice teams construct their initial 53-man rosters. NFL teams were informed that the NFLPA vetoed the revised emergency third quarterback rule that would have allowed teams to elevate a bona fide QB from the practice squad an unlimited number of times. So the rule reverts to the 2023 version, which says the emergency third quarterback must be on the 53-man roster, not in elevation. Curious to see now how this impacts that rule here. So I'm sure coaches aren't very happy about that.
No, not when you have an opportunity to manipulate the rosters, which are you already got to jump through hoops in order to do that. So that's an interesting update, especially as we're talking about quarterbacks, because to me, I mean, I would rather keep all three of these guys if it means that you're not getting proper trade value for Jarrett Stidham. I think that you keep Jarrett Stidham around until you get the right offer for him, even though both Stidham and Zach Wilson, their contracts expire after this year. So to me, I think Stidham at his price tag would have trade value. Like you mentioned, Cody, guys like Trinity Benson, you trading them for a 5th and a 7th. Josh Dobbs last year traded for a 5th round pick and then traded again for a 6th round pick after that. So you're telling me Jarrett Stidham, nobody's going to want him for a late round draft pick? Like, a team like the New York Giants or the Minnesota Vikings or the Green Bay Packers who don't have a competent backup right now, or there's just a number of scenarios around the league right now where Jarrett Stidham makes a lot of sense for a lot of teams. And so I wouldn't be shocked if he's the one that's traded when it all is said and done.
Well, certainly there's going to be a lot of movement here around the league. You're going to see trades, I think, today. I think you're going to see it on Tuesday. Between teams. We've already seen some trades a little bit earlier as well. And there's been some teams who've gotten ahead of roster cuts as well. They've already released a handful of players so far on the Broncos side of things. Not a lot of movement there. But obviously by 2:00 p.m. Mountain Time on Tuesday, that is going to be the narrative. Okay, hey, the roster gets trimmed down. Does Denver make any trades? Does Denver trade for anybody in terms of that? Like, that, to me, I think is going to be something we see. Because I think usually here, you're not going to see a player for a player. You're usually going to see a player traded for draft capital or a player acquired for draft capital as well. So I'm very curious to see what the Broncos, Sean Payton, George Payton decide to do in this situation. We also have some other superlatives around this roster that are coming to fruition here. Who is the biggest surprise cut candidate? Who would be the toughest player for the Broncos to put on waivers? And 2 positions we think the Broncos will target from other teams' roster cuts. You'll get that much more here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel Sportsbook. And as you all know at FanDuel, they are America's #1 sportsbook. And you've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel. Well, we have something a little bit different for you because now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. That's right. All FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel at any time. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. Once again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Place $5 bet and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, we'll dive deep into some other roster superlatives on the eve of roster cuts, 90 to 53 players. And as always, I think one of the things, Sayre, that I always like to factor in is just being around these players, getting to interview a lot of these guys that, consider long shots to make the roster. There's always a tough time around the NFL, and certainly hoping all these guys land on their feet. Talking to some players in the locker room after Sunday's game, they're like, hey, we understand the business of this, but we've grown really close with this locker room and the group of guys that we have here. So some guys are going to be, looking for opportunities elsewhere. Some guys may never play in the NFL ever again. Like, that's just a possible scenario here for some of these guys. So definitely always want to keep the human element, in perspective here. I think that's important. I know that's how I'll always operate. I know you and I are very much aligned in that. I know sometimes it's not always that case in terms of the conversation about players on social media. But with that said, we are going to get into some deeper roster superlatives here. If you had to go through biggest surprise candidate, who do you think it would be here for the Broncos?
We have some interesting names that you and I discussed off camera a little bit ago, Cody. I think one of the biggest surprise cut candidates for me has got to be Michael Burton, the fullback. Dating it back to what I said, what the CBS broadcast team said, I think a lot of fans would be surprised to see him cut because, well, he's the true fullback on the roster, right? Nate Adkins, kind of a hybrid guy. But we did see Nate get a lot more work at fullback this preseason. And so I just can't help but wonder, could you easily bring a guy like Burton back onto your practice squad? Is some other team going to offer him so much money to say, hey, we want you to come in and be our full-time fullback? I think Michael would get paid appropriately on the practice squad. You could elevate him when you feel is necessary. And he could still be, like you said earlier, Cody, that mentor to somebody like Nate Adkins. So just as we're trying to play the game of roster gymnastics, I could see his name being one of the surprise guys, but I think yours is a little bit more spicy than mine.
Well, to that point, right? You mentioned Michael Burton. Like, you and I had talked about it in the stock up, stock down. I think Burton stays on the roster, does the mentorship thing like you mentioned there with Nate Adkins, but I think Nate Adkins makes the Broncos 53-man roster at the expense of Lucas Kroll, who, look, we've been excited about Lucas. I've seen the flashes of Lucas in practice. When you look at the preseason production, he's just not there yet, right? And that doesn't mean that he won't be on the practice squad. I just think it means that maybe Nate Adkins can push him off of the 53-man roster because Nate right now is going to offer you more as like a potential blocker, also as a receiving option, and also a core 4 special teams guy, whereas Lucas is going to have to really carve out a role for himself. And unless there's an injury to Adam Troutman or Greg Dulcich, who are the 2 guys ahead of him right now, that is the dilemma in which we run into. So for me, I think the biggest surprise cut for me would be Lucas Kroll in this situation. Broncos Country, let us know who you think your biggest surprise cut will be. Let's get into this next one here because I also think this is an interesting one to dive into. Who would be the toughest player to have to put on waivers in a sense to try to say, okay, hey, is this guy going to pass it through? I feel like there's a multitude of options here. It's always the risky run. Who do you have in mind?
Anybody that you drafted, right? I mean, recently would be tough to put on waivers, or guys that you kind of have drawn or sort of. We talked about Brandon Johnson earlier, and I think the attachment is there though for a lot of fans with a guy like Jaylen Virgil, Cody. He would be really tough to put on waivers, I think, because you see the potential, you see the playmaking ability, you see kind of the unique size, speed, and all those sorts of things. Brings value on the kick return game, brings value in other special teams phases. So you feel like a guy like that would probably get plucked off waivers. I know this time of year you fear that everybody's going to get claimed on waivers, and then very rarely does that actually happen. But at the same time, it would still be tough to see that come across the wire, like Jaylen Virgil has been cut by the Broncos or waived by the Broncos. Like that would be tough because you feel like at that point somebody around the league from the coaching staffs that have been around the last couple of years would try to get him onto their team.
I mean, the Pittsburgh Steelers could be one. Zach Azzani down there, working with those guys. Obviously the former connection with Russell Wilson is certainly there. Maybe the New York Jets. I mean, I know Nathaniel Hackett loved Jaylen Virgil. I know last year Jaylen Virgil was on track to make the 53-man roster, but I just think Jaylen, and I agree with you, that would be my pick too. Jaylen offers so much value to you overall, not just I think he can contribute as a receiver. Look, he almost had a touchdown there. He got pulled on the jersey a little bit there, ended up, costing a potential touchdown there. But, he had a catch across the middle of the field. Yeah, I thought he blocked well in terms of the receiving game as well to set up some runs. He pancaked a couple of dudes there, but also he's a core 4 specialist that will play in every major special teams unit you need from Mike Westhoff. To me, that gives him immediate value. Even though like guys like Devon Vele and Troy Franklin, we think are going to make the 53-man roster at receiver specifically, Jaylen is a guy that will probably contribute and have a bigger impact than those guys in an all-around format. So to me, that would be the toughest part here is if that was, in fact, a guy like Jaylen Virgil. We'll see, how things plan out. I know he wants to stay in Denver, but he's gotten bigger, Sayre. Like he's bulked up in the offseason. You could definitely tell the physicality is there, but his explosiveness is still there after the major knee injury that he had last season that kept him out of action. So definitely something to watch here. Now we'll get into our final superlative here on today's episode of Locked On Broncos, here part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. 2 positions the Broncos will target to add to their roster from other teams' roster cuts as they're scouring. And Sean said this as well. He said, we're going to be eyeing and monitoring other teams' cuts to bring in players. What position groups do you think they will look at?
Well, I'm going to start off with just kind of offensive weapon, just because Sean Payton consistently refers back to Taysom Hill when he talks about these kind of things. This is where we discovered Taysom Hill, and so with the help of David Shaw, obviously George Payton and his entire scouting department, the pro scouts and things like that, I think that it's going to be interesting to see who they would target as of, if we're talking offensive weapons and maybe specifically at tight end, because like you mentioned, I mean, maybe Lucas Kroll is a surprise cut candidate, but if that is the case, if they do cut Lucas, I mean, have we grown a little too confident in Greg Dulcich staying healthy? Because if Greg goes down, then all of a sudden your pass catching options are not at the tight end position. So if you lose Lucas, that is, if he's not on the practice squad, right? So maybe that offensive skill spot, I'm not necessarily saying just tight end or just wide receiver, but maybe somebody that could play a unique role. Sean Payton's always looking for jokers out there, right? So maybe somebody there could be that hits the waiver wire that Sean is like, hey, that could be the next Taysom Hill, or that could be a potential joker option for my offense.
Well, it was Lucas Kroll last year who they targeted in terms of waivers and cuts, and very curious to see. I mean, they could, like, tight end seems to be a position of value for them. And yeah, like if Lucas does get cut and obviously you bring him back to the practice squad, you were right. I mean, the Broncos tight end room is the same, really, outside of Chris Manhertz not being there as it was last year. And one injury away from being like, oh crap, we're back in this position. So is there a contingency plan? Maybe, maybe not. I'm very curious to see how it plays out. I think offensive line depth, considering the fact that, hey, Quinn Bailey's injury was a massive blow to them. Palczewski has had his up and down moments. DeMontre Jacobs has had some up and down moments. Alex Forsythe has had some up and down moments here in the preseason. Is your depth strong enough now, right? I don't think that you've gotten a great look, especially with guys like Will Sherman, Matt Peart. I have not liked what I've seen from those guys here in this preseason slate. So I think that the offensive line will be another position that they take a strong look at here. So tight end, O-line, the blocking department, maybe some athletic pass catching from the tight end group, as you mentioned, is going to be needed here this upcoming season. I would even say maybe safety. If we throw a wild card position there, I'd say safety right now, considering, hey, Brandon Jones didn't play yesterday, but went through pregame warmups and kind of prepared there. I guess the plan was that he was never going to play. That's what he told us post-game inside the locker room, but he was just going to go out there and get a feel for it. And hey, I hope that helps. And I hope he can stay healthy, because if there's an injury there, like, okay, hey, Devin Key's the next man up, but how's it going to play out behind Devin Key? Like, that's our biggest question that we have. So there is a lot at stake here for this Broncos roster here as roster cuts are approaching. As we said earlier, Broncos Country, Tuesday, 2:00 p.m. Mountain Time. Denver will have to be down to 53. What type of movement will be made there? We'll have a reaction to the 53-man roster once that becomes finalized here on Locked On Broncos. And that's what you can expect if you're an everyday listener for tomorrow's episode of the show. With that said, Broncos Country, we will see you tomorrow for a brand new episode as Denver starts to fill out their roster and all the preparation now shifts to the Seattle Seahawks. We'll see you then.